processing that, and I know there's so many interpretations of the outcome of the climate negotiations, but what I wanted to center on today is what's been at the center of my work, and where I sit within climate justice. Yeah, we can pause there, is to look at those who are most impacted by climate change, what we call MAPA communities. So that involves, primarily Indigenous communities who are, protecting and living with biosystems and resisting extractivism, as well as those on the front lines of the impacts. So my work actually started not so much as in climate change, but more in Indigenous rights and looking at the impacts of extractivism on Indigenous communities. And I think that's something that we need to come away from the COP with understanding, is that one, this agreement is voluntary, and the forces that are driving extractivism, that are driving the the violence against Indigenous people, extraction of fossil fuels, has in no way been more regulated. So I think that's just something for me, while we need to celebrate wins and mark developments in what has been achieved, in terms of where my work sits in terms of looking at extractivism, not much has really changed in terms of that. So in terms of, this is a creative strategies workshop, and the way I want to frame this is that for me, as I mentioned, my work actually started as an Indigenous rights ally. I'm not Indigenous, I'm a Sikh, Punjabi, British Canadian person. So I just want to acknowledge that I work in allyship with communities on the front lines. So that's also something to know about, where we sit on these spectrums of identity. So I just wanted to bring that into it, because this isn't a space for us to feel bad about where we sit in the spectrum of power and privilege. It's for us to step into that and to hold that in this moment, to unlock the power, the potential, the allyship, and the solidarity that we have access to. So just to zoom out a little bit to the globe. So as I mentioned, my work has been looking at kind of tipping points. And if we look at the globe, and if we pull back, the Amazon, we often hear about deforestation in the Amazon, but my work has been in the boreal forest. And there's been a race to extract tar sands oil, which is heavy oil. So, it's really polluting. It's 3 to 5 times more polluting. It uses large amounts of water, gas, and there were even proposals to use nuclear energy to extract tar sands, to put a nuclear bomb there to get out bitumen. So we're really talking about, the dirtiest of the dirty fossil fuels. And so in that understanding of what was happening there, for me, it became really clear that the intersection of Indigenous rights, protection of biodiversity, and averting further climate crisis were, second to none. They overlay each other, they interconnected with each other. And for me, while that understanding came through the science and understanding, when we're talking about being creative and being in our entire identities in this work, a large part of that understanding actually came through living with Indigenous communities, doing ceremony, living on the land, witnessing the changes, listening to stories about the change. And I think that's something that often gets, in a colonial perspective, relegated as lesser than knowledge. But that's something that I really try and work as a creative practitioner, to be able to bring all those modalities back into the work. So it's just something wanted to stay there. So next slide. So yeah, this is the scale of the tar sands, and I think this connects back to the introduction where we were talking about you know, the grief that we find ourselves in and the reality of what we find ourselves in. And I think it's really important that we also don't look away from that. And while we want to stay hopeful and transformative, for me, witnessing the tar sands, bearing witness to it, and walking through that, seeing the scale of the devastation, this full size of this extraction zone is almost the size of England and Wales. It's not clean upable, it cannot be remediated. And even if we do plant trees there, the relationship with that land, the traditional uses, the relationship with that land cannot be replaced. And you know, the experience of witnessing that actually took me many months to be able to vocalize. And it was actually through working with the Social Sculpture Lab, working with creative practices of remembering it with my eyes closed, of speaking to other people about it, by drawing it, by going there and walking through it in my mind. It was a really powerful experience of trying to understand what it meant to be a human being on this planet at this time, that this is what we're going through. So, you know, again, we've just come out of a really technical 2 weeks of climate negotiations. And I think it's really important that we bring these parts of ourselves back to looking at these situations, at understanding what's happening, so that we can move through those feelings and be able to address the reality of what's happening. So we can go to the next slide. So yeah, in the work to amplify and act in solidarity and work with my privilege that I have as someone who was at the time in London, I had access to the Canadian High Commission. You know, a lot of the corporations that are fueling the tar sands are based out of the UK. So those are banks and also the UK government. You know, the UK government signed treaties with the Indigenous communities to protect their rights to the land. And those treaties are supposed to be sovereign to sovereign relationships. So Indigenous communities are meant to be consulted when extraction happens on their land or any projects, which is called free, prior and informed consent. However, that's not what has happened. So in 2009, we started a campaign, UK Tar Sands Network, and it was a very grassroots campaign. And you know, we see a lot of these images of actions like now, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what was behind the scenes, that, you know, all of these campaigns were run in solidarity with frontline communities, down to the logo, you know, the red drip. The chief of the community asked that that be red and not black because it represented the blood of their community. So I wanted to show this example that, you know, even when we're making campaigns and we're making graphics, that we ensure that the communities that we're talking about, that we're representing, that we make time for that consultation. You know, what we're asking of corporations and banks and governments to do, that we bring that into our practice. And you would be surprised how little this actually happens, where communities are you know, asked about messaging, about the story, the narrative, because it's not just the impacts of the climate crisis or what's happening now, it's the narrative, it's the deep root causes and the geopolitical understanding of how we got there and how that's represented as well. So just wanted to sort of, you know, bring that to the table, that we see a lot of stunts and actions like this now, but it's really important to take that time. And, you know, with Zoom and digital communication, it's a lot easier. It does take more time, but it means that you are creating legacy with the artworks that you create for those communities, and instruments as well that can be used beyond that action. So next slide. Sorry that I'm having to do that. So again, this is, you know, a lot of the campaigns that we did were very economically sound in terms of calling out the financial roots of the crisis. We were looking at insurance, you know, a lot of the language coming from Mark Carney now to divest from fossil fuels came from these campaigns that were co-created with Indigenous frontline communities. But at the core of it as well, there's this other element of the activism, and sometimes these parts of activism aren't acknowledged because they're not tangible, they're not quantifiable. You know, you can't get funding to go to a healing walk, which is exactly what this image is. This image is from the tar sands, where we walked through the tar sands, and the communities wanted to not only talk about the devastation happening, but also offer prayer for the waters, for the other beings, and also to start imagining a future beyond that. So I think that's something to think about as well, that, you know, often in our rage or in our own metaphysical understanding or power analysis of what's needed, there can be sometimes other things that are needed from the community. So again, that's where the consultation with the community can change the form of action that's being asked or what's needed at the moment. You know, sometimes communities have been speaking out for you know, since 1492 about this destruction, and they need something else. They might need a moment of healing. They might need resources in their communities as well. So that's just a note on, you know, thinking about the cultures of activism that we inherit, and that there are a whole spectrum of other ways and other ways of confronting power. So next slide. And so, as well as looking at the banks and the corporations, the financial institutions, and the power structures that connect to this extractivism, another part of it has been looking at the art institutions. So some of you might know groups like BP or Not BP, and Liberate Tate. And so that's a coalition called Art Not Oil. So, you know, that work has been what we did was to really try and expose how art galleries were complicit in allowing these corporations to clean up their image. What we call is the social license to operate. So, you know, this picture was taken just a few weeks after the, you know, devastating BP Deepwater Horizon spill. And there was a summer party at the Tate, and BP was there, and it just felt, you know, inappropriate beyond anything that these oil companies were giving the corporations space to clean up their reputation. But a note on this action, I actually have conflicting feelings about it, because I think it brought that reality, but then ironically, it was Mexican workers who were cleaning it up afterwards. And so I think there's something there about also thinking about the life cycle of an action or an intervention. I think, you know, people should just stay behind and clean up. That's just a point of, you know, also thinking about when we're designing actions, how it, you know, responds to the workers, the security guards, the people, all of those people in that space as well. So it's just a little thought about how we mirror some of those values in our interventions as well. Next slide. So as we saw at the COP, huge amounts of lobbying is taking on behind the scenes, and you know, the COP was an extreme example of that. But that lobbying is continually happening to undermine all of the progress we see towards regulating fossil fuels transport regulation. So we were working around a piece of transport legislation called the Fuel Quality Directive, which is the most boring piece of transport legislation, like a tiny piece of transport legislation that was going through the EU parliamentary process for about 6 years. And so our task was to try and think about how can we make something really boring, really technical, catch the imaginations of people, and to spell out some of these relationships. You know, how is a transport legislation that's being passed in Europe, how does it connect to communities that can seem far away from us, from beings that can seem far away from us, and animals and ecosystems? So what we did was we went outside of a meeting that was happening where Canada and the UK were working together with the oil industry and banks to expose this meeting. And so what we did was I worked with Lucy Sparrow, who's an awesome felt artist. She makes all sorts of like entire shops and sex shops, everything out of felt completely. And she worked with us, and we built this scene of the felt impacts of the tar sands. So, you know, animals that had tumors, pipelines. And so one thing was to try and reach a different audience. It was to do something different for ourselves. You know, there's only so many times you can stand in the rain with a banner. And also to create entry points for other people who couldn't necessarily come to an action like this, either because of their work schedule, their identity, their history, or relationship to policing. So we held spaces where people could come and sew, they could be involved in that part of making. So I think that's something to also think about, is how we give entry points, safe spaces, ways for people to be part of actions when they can't necessarily, you know, they might not physically be there, but want to be involved, and acknowledging all of those roles, the person who cooks the meal, to hold that space as well. So that's just something that sometimes in the speed of things, or in that urgency to act, we can leave behind those people as well. So I think that's something to think about, and reaching new audiences, reaching new communities, and in the collaborations, you know, the artists bring with them other communities, and also other ways of seeing the situation. Sometimes we can have our own blinkers on and our own analysis of the situation, but it helps us to see it from a different point. And next. So yeah, this was a action that we did a few years ago, and it was to really talk about the relationship between the Crown and the UK Crown and the Canadian government. So Kate Middleton was traveling to Alberta, Canada, where the tar sands are. And so we wanted to, we gifted her this series of hats. There were 10 hats that were commissioned for her. And this hat was actually really fun. I wore this to a lot of Halloween parties. But you know, the idea was to, one, communicate this relationship between the Crown and the Canadian government in a slightly different way, you know, working a little bit with the strange. I think sometimes, you know, ecological art can be really like heavy, and it hits you over the head with the conclusions. But sometimes if we can work with the strange a little bit, draw people in, like, what is this? Why is it there? It can sort of help people enter into it into a different way, create different kinds of conversations. And this was before Instagram. So we also bought, we had banner ads in Grazia magazine. So it was also, again, like going to different audiences, different ways of having the conversation. And I don't know why she didn't want to wear it. I think it looks pretty great. But that's just, you know, thinking about, again, in the collaboration, and also what that does, again, the conversations that we had with the hat makers in the design process was so useful in terms of stepping outside of our campaigner head sometimes, and assuming that people have all this information, and instead bringing people on the journey, bringing people on that journey of understanding these deep colonial relationships, the devastation that's happening there as well. So we can carry on. Thank you. So for me, one of my biggest, I think, teachers in this work has been Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Agani Nine. And, you know, a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of the work that I had been doing was very focused on banks and corporations and the very technical aspects of it. But then as a queer woman of color in this space, a lot of the times we're also called to question the culture of activism, to point attention to it so that we can continue to exist in it, so that we can address, what we call the movement within the movement. And for me, Ken Saro-Wiwa became an incredible mentor in terms of doing that, because within Ken's work, he was both an activist and working to create the Ogoni Bill of Rights. And the Ogoni Bill of Rights is an incredible piece of work. It's worth reading. It explicitly makes the connection between the rights of the Indigenous communities and how that is connected to ecological rights. So I think that was a big part of his contribution, but also he was a comedic playwright. He wrote dramas. He wrote like the equivalent of EastEnders in Nigeria, where he would bring these complex issues around farming, access to land, people's attitudes towards shell and oil into those spaces. So I think that's something as well. Often there can be this language of like, oh, how do we get them to understand? And I think it's actually more that more people are having these conversations. What's needed is spaces to be able to unpack them, think about how they reflect on our daily lives as well. So I think that's something really for us to remember if we're working in that space of how do we go to where people are already having conversations, and how do we also not condescend, but think about how that conversation is happening there. So we can go to the next slide. And so carrying on with this relationship with the Ogoni Nine and Ken Saro-Wiwa, it was actually this memorial was created after 20 years of the execution of Ken and the Ogoni Nine, which happened in 1995 on November the 11th. That anniversary just passed. And we worked with a British-Nigerian sculptor, Sakari Douglas Camp, and she created this amazing bust. It's this life-size sculpture, and the sculpture toured for many years around the UK to talk about this relationship between Shell and the Nigerian community. At the back of it, it has a library, it has a cinema, and it says, "I accuse the oil companies of genocide against the Ogoni Nine." So this bus had quite a relationship with the communities. And so for the anniversary of the 20 years of execution, the communities actually asked for it to come back to Nigeria. So that was my task, was to figure out how to get this bus on a ship back to Nigeria. And it actually fell in the sea. That wasn't my fault. I think it was Shell, but I'm just that's just speculation. So it actually fell in the sea, and then we got it out again and cleaned it all up. And then eventually it did get on a ship to Nigeria, where it was going to travel through the communities, eventually getting to Port Harcourt, to Ken's hometown. But when it got to the customs, we can go to the next slide. When it got to customs, the colonel who had been responsible for the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa was suddenly the customs officer, and impounded the bus and took it, and we've never seen it again. But what we did was we quickly thought about how could we turn this moment into something that could, one, share the story, two, we make use of that moment. So we worked with John Daniel, who's a designer who sadly passed on, and he designed all sorts of graphics for Parliament, Funkadelic, and he made these graphics for us, and they quickly went on to quite viral on Nigerian hip hop, radio stations, and on Twitter. So suddenly there was this movement for the bus, to save the bus, and it was really a powerful moment, because it meant that we got the story of Ken to a new generation, and just the I think the absurd act of that solidarity, I think I still find it quite, that we even tried that. It was a real gesture of that solidarity. And the other thing was to connect it to the on the ground needs. We can go to the next slide. And so, you know, all the while, oh, actually back, sorry. All the while, it wasn't about the bus. It was about Shell's pollution in Ogoniland. So we set up meetings with the government, you know, pretending to want to ask about the bus, but really we would bring 3 or 4 people from the community and start asking about remediation, cleanup costs, you know, the justice for the murder of Ken and the Ogoni Night. So that's just, you know, to say that when we do artistic interventions, when we're working with people's stories, with people's struggles, it's essential that the end goals and the spaces that they create to intersect with power, to negotiate with power, that we find ways to continue to work with communities with that. And I think that's something really important, because we often have a lot of artworks that are illustrative of the crisis, or you know, talk about somebody's struggle. But it's really essential that, you know, especially if you're talking about people who have passed, that you have relationship with their families, with the current situation on the ground, so that artwork can become a part of that struggle, that can be a vehicle, yeah, and working in solidarity. Again, going back to those principles of consultation, of making sure it's effective for what's needed on the ground. Yeah, so next one. So yeah, this is my least favorite subject, but we have to talk about it. You know, as I said, as a person of color working within the climate movement, we really have to address, even if we like it or not, the white supremacy that comes up in organizing and in climate communications. And, you know, for me, I was called upon a lot from community activists to talk about the lack of consultation and representation for communities of color, and when that, you know, that first emergence of Extinction Rebellion. And I think, you know, what we take away from that is the lessons and what's happened. And I think it's really important that we talk about the fact that, you know, many climate organizers like myself have had our resources, our ability to do actions, our ability to access the media stripped by that. And I think it's interesting because on the one hand, yes, we need more people and we need to build movements, but we have to think about who gets to do that, whose legacies are being used for that as well. And there's real implications for visibility. As we know, visibility brings resources. It also retells the history of climate organizing. So, you know, there is this moment where people think that climate organizing just started in 2018 or so, but even in my own life, it's been going on for nearly 2 decades. So it's really important about how we tell the story of climate movements, who is visible, and how we get access to that as well. So can go forward. So yeah, and I think it's really important when we talk about this that we're talking about it to develop allyship, to develop solidarity, and also to expose how much labor goes into remaining visible. So, you know, even though I'm a climate campaigner who's trained in, you know, complex financial campaigns and strategies, so much of my energy and work has had to be in fighting for basic visibility. So this is an action that happened just before the COP in Paris. That's me on the left, the little one. And, you know, this action was us trying to hold the front space and to talk about the framing of the climate crisis for ourselves. And a few moments later, we had the banner ripped off us. There was Vivienne Westwood and giraffes, and we were erased from the front of that march. And so, you know, it's not just the photo that ends up in the newspaper. It's and who is leading the climate movement. Again, it's our framing of the climate crisis, our understanding of the crisis, and also what's needed of it. So, you know, as a climate organizer, I would much rather talk about the intricacies of insurance and fossil fuels and biodiversity. But as communities of color, we have to be continually rewriting ourselves into the story. And I think that's something about how we've had to become very creative with that. So next slide. Yeah, so as I said, this is for me, what is BAME? So great. Yeah, so for me, as I said, you know, I much rather be working with frontline communities, confronting Shell, getting up to, you know, doing shareholder organizing. But it actually became impossible to continue to be a climate organizer around 2018. We were being drowned out, we couldn't access any resources. And so I started then working at the Social Sculpture Research Institute in Oxford. And to put that into the context of art, there's an artist called Joseph Beuys, and Joseph Beuys was, you know, a artist who very much was interested in kind of, you know, dismantling the white cube. The famous phrase is everyone is an artist. And that doesn't mean that everyone is good at art necessarily. It means, well, everyone is, but it means that we are all creating the world. We are all creating the social fabric of reality. You know, even the COP agreement, it's a creation, it's a artwork, laws, they are created. And it's about us realizing that we're all participating in that and coming to kind of an existential awareness of that power, and then turning that into the forms of art that we take. So I was really lucky to study with Shelley Sachs, who was a contemporary of Joseph Beuys, and sort of came to her with my burnout and fatigue and ready to walk away from being a climate organizer. But, you know, after you've witnessed something like the tar sands, when you when you're holding responsibilities to our communities, you can't really walk away. So that's where I started doing this research of having conversations about power and privilege in the movement. So what I did was, this black cloth was actually like a cloth from one of the actions. It was an oil spill. And I cut it into a circle and just put it into the center. I was like, when this cloth is down, this is a safe space. And when this cloth is down, the reality of our communities is a truth. And if you want to stay, have that conversation. And what we did was we started mapping. So we started mapping where we sit in relationship to power. And so there was these small counters that we had, and there was a small map for ourselves. So in this process of speaking honestly about our power privilege, but in a really simple way from our biographies, because sometimes there can be so much language around power and privilege that in itself can be alienating. And also, as I said, you know, even though in Brexit Britain, I'm, you know, an Asian person who people prefer, I wasn't there. When we think about ourselves globally, we have different layers of power and privilege that I also wanted to investigate. Where do I sit with my privilege in relationship to Indigenous people? So this became a process, and it was really useful I did it with different NGOs and different organizers. And the idea is that we then start to think about how we can change, and we can change our understanding of our power and privilege when we listen to each other. You know, and, you know, the moments like, you know, someone could say, oh, I didn't realize that not having to pay a mortgage was a privilege. Like, oh, okay, nice. You just realized that. Maybe that will change how you react to your co-workers, or not realizing that having meetings in the evening means that those who don't have childcare can't come. So that's the idea, really, is that as we as we look into our power and privilege, as we lean into it, we start realizing how that changes the forms of how we organize, and the barriers and the bridges that can have, but also that we're movable as we listen to each other, and the forms can change as well. Just carry on from there. So yes, so this is thinking about some of those processes, tying it all together. So this is just one of the exhibitions I had where we had a megaphone, and I actually rewired the megaphone so that it's a listening device. So you can actually listen through it and you can hear, it's really cool. You can hear like ants walking and all sorts of things, but it was really to embody that principle of working, that before we get on the megaphone, that we have a listen, that we check in. And I think, if you've studied art, or those of you who are artists, you know that 95% of it is research, is understanding the context that you're working in, of understanding the history, the legacies that you're working into. So I really wanted to bring that into climate activism, because we've got a little bit stuck in the forms. They can be, get the banner, shout, scream, 90s drum and bass vibe. So how do we create processes for ourselves? And it can be really hard because we are in a crisis, we are in emergency, and there is that sense of urgency. But how do we breathe some space into that to slow down, to question the forms that we've inherited, to think about how they bring people in, how they exclude people, to really bring consultation and collaboration into it, and also to bring new forms. We're in a space where there is fatigue. People are fatigued, and we're seeing the same images over and over again. We've also had a lot of illustration of the crisis. How, through collaboration, can we create artworks that actually have new forms? I'm really inspired by this group called Bucket Brigade, and they work with artists and communities to measure the air and the quality of air in their communities. So also becoming more interdisciplinary, and as we become more interdisciplinary, work more in collaboration, we can also come up with new forms of activism, as we know now that a lot of the gaps that exist for the climate agreement, a lot of this work's going to fall on us to respond and to continue that work. So that's why we also, I think, when we're talking about creativity, we're talking about becoming researchers and becoming those interdisciplinary practitioners. Okay, next. Yeah, so, this is an image that came out of a cyclone that happened just at as we went into the global pandemic. There was a massive cyclone Amphan, which impacted northern India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and there was a complete broken telephone when it came to us understanding that this crisis was happening. It wasn't talked about within the climate movement. We're still in this space, as we saw from COP, with there being no commitment to funds for those already impacted by climate disasters, that we're still in this kind of futurism when it comes to the climate crisis. But we are already in an emergency. We already need to be responding as humanitarians, and using as much of what we've learned from the mutual aid strategies and tools and empathetic culture, to think about how do we bring that into the climate work that we do. So these were some images, just stunning and shocking images that youth were creating in Bangladesh. And so I worked just to get the images out so we could even get the basic mutual aid links shared. But this is a real, concrete way that we need artists to fill the gaps again, that there is a real gap. The humanitarian sector is over here, the climate sector is over here, and they're not talking to each other at all. So we need to think about how, by listening to what's happening, by understanding those gaps, we start thinking about how we situate ourselves. Okay, next. Okay, I'm going to skip that one. we've kind of got into that. Yeah, and so, you know, the way I talk about this work is that it's a constant recentering process. None of us has figured out how to respond to climate catastrophe in the middle of a pandemic with rising fascism. We're constantly thinking, recentering. And so that's a process where we, you know, we're calling in, or we're constantly thinking as artists, as visual makers, how do we make sure that we are bringing the voices in that need to be there? So, you know, in this image, you know, we're seeing a lot of the replication of the white supremacy that I went through in a new generation. You know, even at this last COP, we're seeing, you know, Black youth of color being cut out of pictures still. And so we need to be thinking about how do we, you know, not continue that cycle. So as curators, as image creators, as, you know, wherever you are creating works, wherever you're amplifying, you know, who you choose to amplify, who gets to tell the story matters. And it's not, yeah, not in any way an attack against Greta. You know, I'm a sibling of an autistic youth, and I think what she's doing is amazing. But what we need to make sure is that we're not replicating that white supremacy, because it takes so much energy away from that. So that's just something about, you know, if also who we lift up. And we're in an age where, you know, it's all about clicks and follows. So we need to also do our research. You know, how do we amplify youth who don't necessarily have huge followings, but are doing the on-the-ground work? Again, you know, research, digging a little bit deeper, going beyond the shiny to understand who needs to be amplified, because there's real on-the-ground consequences for that in terms of, you know, coming out of this COP, who will get funding, who will get resources to continue the work. It will be those who are most visible. So that's another way we can work in allyship to yeah, lift up different voices. So next. Yeah, and again, I want to stress just how much work is involved in just staying visible. This was an exhibition that we did at Somerset House, and it was a collaboration with Yara and Davina, and they were talking about, you know, the dates that people arrive on the earth and when they leave. And so they had this board where you could submit the date. And so I did a takeover to put in some of the names of, you know, Black and brown and Indigenous climate activists. And so, you know, we're continually looking, yeah, and imagine the works that we could actually create if we weren't just bogged down in visibility and addressing white supremacy. So that's an invitation as well to think about how, again, how do we create allyship and solidarity so that, you know, those of us who aren't just on the front line of the impacts, but also on the front lines of the strategies can get to work at this time. Next one. Okay, go, carry on. Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to close out here and just sort of wrap things up a little bit. But really, you know, when I speak about being an artist within the climate justice space, it's really about being, you know, aware of the frontline situations, being aware of the, and also taking a critical stand. We don't often have critical spaces to talk about what's happening. Otherwise, you're being like a hater, or you're bringing the room down. But we really need like spaces to philosophically unpack the climate movement and its culture. So, you know, the culture of climate activism is sometimes taken as a given, but when we're working in an international context and when we're working in a complex context, we have to understand there are so many different ways of taking action. There are so many different legacies that we're coming into, and that really opens up the strategies and the spaces that we have available to us. The other thing is to come into the post-COP reality that we're in now, that we actually have to be very innovative, very interdisciplinary, and yes, come up with new forms to keep people engaged, and also to address the gaps in terms of still keeping fossil fuels in the ground, not just phasing them out, and also this gap that exists with responding to the the real-time crisis that is emerging. So that's just a little bit of, yeah, my practice, and I kind of want to open up that. We're going to take a break in a minute, but I just wanted to sort of, in the spirit of Joseph Beuys, really expand that idea of what we mean about being an artist within the climate space, and what it means to innovate and to collaborate in that. So we'll take a little break, and I'll just pause for questions too, because that was a lot.
Thank you so much for that, Suzanne. There's a lot to digest there, and but definitely bringing a lot of quite personal things in my lineage as well. My research was in Pakistan. It wasn't in the coast, and even when I was doing that research, it felt like I was about to write a eulogy, and that process of that, when you said that it took you so long to process your grief. And so now I'm thinking maybe I should go to art school and process that grief. And another moment that really stood out was when you were talking about the bus and how the Nigerian authorities responded to it. Again, in Pakistan, a similar thing happened. There was somebody had made an art piece about forced disappearances by the government, by the authority, mysterious disappearances. Many of them were frontline environmental defenders, and there was an art piece made, and the police came and smashed it to pieces. And then the next day it was frontline, like, headline news. So they actually ended up amplifying the forced disappearances in their action of destroying the artwork. And this process with the bus, that it disappeared, which then led to this reignition and this being able to share this story with another generation is so powerful. So it's interesting who your collaborators can end up being sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one, I don't know if I'd recommend art school. I'm joking, but no, definitely having that time to process, to work with other people, to come back into what you've been working on from a different framework and from a different softness. Like, no, obviously I actually loved my experience there, because I got to look at these situations that we sometimes only look at through economic frameworks, even human rights frameworks, and to look at them through a felt experience, and also to look at, again, at actions as experiences, not just as illustrations. Like, what does it feel like to see that action? I think it's all great. And also what you said about our processing our lineage, like the artwork where we put the names up on the board. I remember doing research into, I'm from northern Rajasthan on the border with Pakistan, the artificial border. And I was looking there at indigenous people, Bishnoi and Bil people, and understanding my own relationship, having come from Punjab and our communities living in the desert. So there's so much that gets, so much rich material that comes out. And also I think sometimes when we talk about intersectionality or race and power and privilege in the climate context, if we can ground it in our biography and in our bones and in the lands that we come from, it's way more generative than if it's super intellectual as well. So I think that's something that can bring us together, can connect us to the soil, and also it made me realize why I'm like this. I'm like, oh, okay, I come from warrior people who live in the desert. Okay, no wonder I'm like this. So yeah, and just the last thing you said there as well about the unexpected, how that artwork had an unexpected life on its own. It took on a life of its own. And also the collaborators, we had Alfredo Yar, who's quite a well-known artist in Chile. worked with us to create some of the graphics as well. So that's another way that some of the artists with, with power, with privilege, with audience, worked in allyship to, lend their skills, lend their voice to that as well. So I think it can really take on its own, life.
Yeah, certainly. So if anyone has more questions, please feel free to write in the chat, or you're welcome to speak up as well. Suzanne, correct me if I'm wrong, but was the Bishnoi community the people who did the first recorded moment of the tree hugging? Was that?
Yeah, that's a community that, is the roots of the Chipko movement that most people know. So, yeah, and I think, again, it's something that we don't often speak about, because often as people of color, we're often responding to whiteness, but also within our communities, there's layers of different identities. Our own peoples have moved. We have own settler relationships as well to indigenous communities as well. So I think it's important as well that we sometimes have space to unpack that, always to think about how we can be in allyship and in relationship as well. So again, I think that's just one thing that I've learned is around, we do power and privilege work, we do that self-reflection so that we can, know who we also stand in relationship to unlock power, and not necessarily always to victimize ourselves. Because we also, as well as being in the UK and in those movements, we also belong to these global movements as diaspora as well. Absolutely. Yeah, if anyone else has any thoughts, reflections, it'd be great to hear from you before we go into a break. No pressure.
Okay, then in that case, should we take a 5-minute break and then come back for our journaling session? If everyone could grab some pen and paper while they're away, and we can meet back in 5 minutes. So it's 3:15, 3:09 where I am, and we'll meet at 3:15, at 15 minutes past the hour. Thank you. Hey everyone, welcome back. Yeah, it would be great if you could turn your cameras back on or write in the chat if you're back in the room. And Suzanne, would you like to take the lead?
Yeah, sure. So just wanted to first to create a little bit of space if you have any thoughts or questions that came up after that first section. Okay.
A bit of housekeeping, Suzanne. Sorry, just a couple of people have messaged me and just asked what time it's going on until.
Okay. Well, originally it was 90 minutes, so we've got another 15 minutes together. So I'm going to give the journaling prompts now. We've got some time to write together. And then people can stay if they want to afterwards feedback, but understand if they need to go. So maybe I'll just transition to that now, unless anyone's got anything they really want to share or ask. No. Oh yeah, hi Rachel, go ahead.
Hello, hi. Yeah, I think that was like so much information, so I'm kind of like processing a lot of it, but thank you. But there was one small thing just at the end, which is kind of like maybe just easier for me to access at the minute, when you said kind of like the art form can have a life itself. So like when you're hearing kind of creating an action or something and then that takes on a life, I thought that was a really nice thing to think about. It's kind of like, yeah, a different form of life form. But yeah, that's all I've got to say right now.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think it's something kind of like quite humbling as well, because we can think about the artworks as something that we create, and it's taking it outside of that gallery space, and when the work is in service of that community, also just emergent ways that it can take on its own form in itself. And I think that can be really helpful, especially when things go wrong. Like maybe they're not actually going wrong, maybe there's something else for it.
Okay. Yeah, and it's kind of like that, like imagination or ideas are like another form of life as well, that kind of, the life doesn't have to be just this like physical thing that can kind of exist in like the imagination layer or dreams and things.
Exactly. And even the idea, so even the idea of sending the bus felt like a work in itself, this act of solidarity, and to send it, and even though it didn't necessarily get there. And I think that sometimes, again, we have to be often really rational or pragmatic when we're talking about the climate crisis, but that's something we can infuse into that space, is that other understandings of agency and power as well, and collaborators. Great. So I've got a few questions.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my thoughts have finally sort of gelled.
Great.
And I just wanted to remark on something that you said really early on, which gave me some comfort about the different ways in which we can contribute to activism. And I partly say this because I live very rurally with 3 small children, and I always feel like a lame nobody in the movement. But then you said, what we need, conversations are happening, and what we need is more platforms and more spaces opening. And I'm like, there are things that I can do. I don't have to be holding the banner in London or in Glasgow to be relevant to the movement. And in fact, if we were, I feel like probably a lot of people feel like me, you know, stuck somewhere, just, I don't have the first clue of where to like go to the front lines here. But I do know how to choreograph all of the like mothers, you know, to do stuff, whatever it is. And I felt that I've never thought about it in that way, because I've just thought, you know, it's just not a space for me, too bad. I can, you know, support it with funds or whatever. But actually I'm thinking, wait, it's in this creative approach, everyone has a role, and it makes it so much more open. And I think you can recruit so many more people. So that was just a comment on what you said.
Thank you. That makes me feel better as well. That communicating something worthwhile. And I think it's something that we all go through. You know, when I was shutting down refineries and petrol stations, I mean, I physically can't do that anymore because of PTSD. So I also that's why I had to change the forms that I worked in. You know, I wasn't physically at COP. I was running the digital channels for a newspaper and creating the narrative that way. So it's come from my life experience that I've had to shape shift and change who I am and still be part of it. So that's why I think it's important for us to think creatively and question the culture. And that's why the images that we get from the news that are like, unless you're covering yourself in oil or you're on the front line. And the other thing is that when you're working with frontline communities, a lot of the women that I've, you know, people that I've worked with have been mothers first, they've been teachers, and then they're also having to run a legal trial to stop extraction on their front line. The people who started the Standing Rock movement was a 16-year-old mom who woke up and was like, how am I going to give my child water? Okay, let's walk to Barack Obama. That's so, you know, we're that breaking that down and realizing that exactly there's so many ways that we need to be involved, different skills that we have. Yeah, that's key to all of it. And then it will change in our life, and that makes it intergenerational as well, and that we can imagining sustaining it as well for different parts of our lives. Thank you. Okay, so well, because we can't all go to art school, I'm just the main thing I got from art school was time to reflect and time to sit with myself and to journal. And I think that's a massive privilege. So I've just got a few questions that are prompts, and we're going to put them up on the screen. And they're basically, you know, obviously we've only got a little bit of time here, but they're just a few questions and a few prompts that might sort of support you to go through that reflection process now. We'll just pull those up. I'll just read through them a little bit, and then we'll have a little bit of time to write. And then if you can stay and you want to share any reflections on what that writing process was like, or any insights that came up, that would be great. Okay, so I'll just explain some of the questions. So yeah, what urgent impulses do I have? So, you know, we're all on different land, we're all on different territories, we're all, you know, what is urgent in you at the moment? Is it, you know, the failures of the COP? Is it the recycling isn't actually being recycled where you live? Is it air pollution? So take some time to ground yourself in your context, in your body, in what isn't alive in you. And again, you know, really pulling from, for me, like those questions, those impulses don't necessarily mean you have the answer to that situation. It can be just that that's what you are thinking about, what is impacting your life. Then the next one is, what are my blind spots? So, you know, that might be, what don't I know about that situation, or what am I, yeah, you know, for me, I live in a place, I live on actually an island at the moment, and I'm not from here. So I'm having to learn language, learn my own privilege here. So just what are some of your blind spots? And then, you know, let's give credit to the stuff that we're already doing. Sometimes it can feel like we have to throw everything out, but what work am I already doing which is aligned with my understanding of the climate crisis? So what are the practices, what are the ways of working that you have been doing, that you want to continue, that you want to deepen, and that you kind of want to give respect to? And then the last one is where we can open it up a bit. So what do I need to learn more about, and what research do I need to engage in? And I think that's one of the most freeing elements, actually. You know, again, we can feel like the seas are rising, we're in this, I've got to get to work tomorrow, but actually, you know, we can open up space for research, for knowing what we don't know, for finding out where we need to step into. So I'm gonna stop there, and if one question pops out to you more than the others, feel free to go deeper on that. So we'll have about 10 minutes, and then we can come back and share any insights either on writing or specific outcomes from those questions, and we'll just leave them up. Okay, so we're about halfway through, got another 5 minutes. Okay, just one last minute to finish off a thought. Okay. So I just wanted to say, first off, that was literally no time. I normally do this as a whole module in a master's program, and we usually have 3 or 4 months to unpack this. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that was like no time at all. But I just wanted to sort of have a chance for us to yeah, take some time to personalize some of what we've heard. And yeah, if you want to feedback anything now, it can be either about the process of writing, something specific that came up, or from the whole session. It would be really lovely to hear from you. Who's feeling brave?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Hello. And also I want to thank you so much for your talk. It was really inspiring and lots of great ideas coming up, firing off. But with this task, it was I found it really useful to look at the bigger issues, but also to have to look at myself.
Nice. Yeah.
So blind spots, for example.
Go ahead. How did you interpret that?
I interpreted that as possibly habits that I have, ways of behaving that might get in the way of the project that I'm trying to do. So I interpreted that as possibly I need to talk less and be a better listener.
That's great. I think that's the thing, it changes so much, right? And just having that space to have that self-reflection with ourselves and without feeling too much judgment on it as well. It's like, that's probably great because you're the first person to speak up as well. So sometimes it's great that you speak up, but yeah, being able to check in with yourself on that, it's great. Thank you. Thanks for opening the conversation. Anybody else? There's no obligation to, just if you want to voice some of the things that came up.
I thank you so much. I don't know if I can say I enjoyed it. I've learnt so much. I've learnt so much this afternoon. And I think the most powerful thing was that when you showed the slide of the destruction, that terrible grey slide, I could feel the absolute pain in your voice. And that was so powerful. That was an extraordinary moment of the tar sands and what you had experienced. And I think that's it's not a gift, but it's something that you've been through. And by that, you can continue to do this fantastic work you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Angie. And I think that's a really important point about like lived experience. And, you know, so much of the work that I do as well is almost creating containers or spaces or ways that we can hear that lived experience of people, because often the numbers, the future scenarios, the parts per million, it doesn't really stay with us. It doesn't transform us as well. So I think that's something that is so powerful that we can do as artists, is to bring that lived experience and lift it up as a way of knowing, a way of knowledge as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I can follow up on the lived experience front. This is nothing I don't think I'd ever expected in my life, to say that one of the things I really want to, one of the groups of people I really want to work with now is menopausal women, because I am entering into that stage of my life and I'm feeling like, wow, there's a lot of there's so much fear and pain and invisibilization and yeah, like lack of sense of self and self-confidence in my peers that I'm seeing. And I'm like, lived experience, I'm entering into the menopausal years, I want to work with menopausal women, and this is, and maybe but in the space of change making, you know, bringing that sort of group together around that. So that's just something that came up for me when I was writing, because even if it's very random for me to start thinking about that. Like that group, I've just been living this change with a lot of friends and sort of seeing how that really reduces and sort of impacts the perceived power women have in the world, this change that we're going through. And I think that that's where I want to do something. So that came up for me about the urgent impulses. So yeah.
Great, thank you. It's so much harder to find who's speaking next in Zoom. I miss in real life stuff. Okay, well, we are at, we were only supposed to go till 1:30. So we've gone a little bit over, so I don't want to creep too much into your time. But I just want to make sure I haven't missed anyone, if there's anything you want to say, or if there's anything Rebecca, and also if there's anything you're working on that you want other people to know, give that a shout out as well.
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to say, for me, the impulses are like, who am I now? You touched on it a bit, Suzanne. I've got long COVID. Life is totally altered. My ability to do things is massively impacted, but I still have all the experience of activism, of creating art, of being a difficult woman. And latterly, learning how to pass the mic. Thank you for the applause. And so for me, it's all about how do I, and joining into those fatigue levels are quite high today. So joining into those, quite effort, all of that, sitting in my bed. This is my real life. This is my embodied presence. This is 90% of my time now is online. So, Suzanne, you're amazing. You've done amazing things, but don't think this isn't real life. This really is real life.
Okay.
For lots of people. So for me, it's kind of, so actually, so where are my urgencies? But for me, the blind spots are as I'm now perhaps joining a disabled community, and I don't know for how long or for how much or what integrity. My blind spots and the work I have to do is all the research into all the disability rights and the lack of disability rights, and how all of that intersects with everything that you've been talking about this afternoon, because that's kind of where I think I'm going to be situated. So, but I'm coming in as a newbie. So I've got lots of things to juggle and tangle, but thank you so much for this. It's been really great to be inside a space and thinking about some of these things, and the invitation to go back to the work of Joseph Beuys. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. And yeah, the metaverse, the digital realm is the real realm. As scary and exciting as that is, not going to get into NFTs now. But I think, yeah, that's a really interesting point, and how we can translate that learning. When I'm in Indigenous communities, I'm quiet, I'm on the side, I'm learning, I'm an ally, and how that experience, that humbling experience is, that deep research, and how we can be changed by that. And exactly what you said about the digital world, I did cut completely. I was working for a Canadian newspaper, sat in Croatia while it's happening in Glasgow. That that international capacity that we have to respond. So how does it also open us up to be in allyship and to create these new forms? And I think we have a lot to learn from mutual aid movements, and how we've been able to respond to each other in that space. So I think also it's about taking our learnings from the different movements we're in, the different spaces we're in, and then bringing that back to the climate movement as well. I can see a hand. Oh.
Hi, can I speak for a second?
Yeah.
So just really, I'm sorry I came in late, and thanks Nessie for letting me in late. So Suzanne, I was just intrigued by the idea of you working with the tar sands. I've got a Creela Coates elder who comes and does men's work with us in England and Ireland. And I asked him once why he did that. And he basically said, unless we come to the white world, to the European world, to the places of power and start to have conversations with people, it doesn't matter how much we heal our communities and recover ourselves and our lands, because there'll be some big tar sands project coming and destroying our land and our water. So I really thank you for the work you've done there. And just to speak also to something that Emily said, so being a part of Frack Free Bristol and Frack Free Somerset in the last few years, trying to get the licenses extinguished, we kind of experimented with Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous understandings of land and Mother Earth, in particular kind of grandmother matriarchal energy before even the Indigenous peoples became more patriarchal. And kind of one of the things that came up is that Aboriginal people who I watched for 10 years would always do activism alongside story, dance, corroboree, art of some kind, but it wouldn't be art in the way we think. It'd be more kind of Indigenous communal performance-based art. And when we were doing the Frack Free Bristol stuff and Frack Free Somerset, and also before that, saving the Bristol parks from development in the early part of the last decade, we would just do walks where we talked about the spirit of the land. And there's a Dreamtime creation myth of Bristol, which we would tell on these walks along the riverbanks, where we would name the river and all the tributaries of the river. And I did that because I saw Aboriginal people doing it, but I didn't really know why I was doing it. And we saved 100 parks and we extinguished the licenses from our water supply. So there's something about not trying to be Indigenous in the place of the scholarship that we might hear the wisdom from, but porting that to our own place, getting to know our local rivers, trying to tune in with Mother Earth locally, figuring out what the big issue is on our doorstep. And just the final thing to say on that, when we went down Gloucester Road in Bristol, we asked people, did you realize that fracking is actually related to your kitchen sink tap? Because they're proposing a fracking site above your reservoir that feeds your kitchen tap. Mm. So to Emily, there's always stuff on our doorstep is my suggestion.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think a few things just that popped out for me is like, yeah, how do we not appropriate Indigenous knowledge and culture, but take the heart of the learning, and the part of that decolonizing and accountability is to connect with the legacy of colonization and the spaces, and also reconnecting to where we are rather than going to the Amazon to do shrooms or something, extreme version. But yeah, so I think that's a really important point about, when we're working in allyship with Indigenous communities, that we're amplifying for them and taking those lessons. And for me, that's exactly what I went through, was a deep relearning about my own Indigenous land relationships and how that brings up responsibility, and also ongoing, keeping that relationship with the land. And I think that's something we forget. We think, oh, well, these practices and relationships that exist with the land happened thousands of years ago. It's like, yeah, they did, but we have to remake them. And some of the communities that I worked with in Canada had gone through residential schooling, attempted genocide by the Canadian government, and often lost a lot of culture and had to recommit to ceremony, to being on the land. So that's also something that we're still making that relationship with the land now, and if that's through song or presencing, and that's a big part of. I didn't get to talk about that today, but yeah, a big part of my work is around biophilia and bionosis. So through loving relationship with the land, the knowledge that comes to us about the land, and I think that's really key. As we're in spaces that are changing. Where I live now, the fish are not in the same place, and it's because people love to fish as well as their livelihood that they're noticing that change. So what is the new knowledge that is created by being in that loving relationship. And it's not always rosy. I mean, I started off as training in herbal medicine and with Indigenous communities, and partly beautiful, but also then you start learning about the devastation that is happening as well. So I think, yeah, finding those ways to that we're still making that knowledge as well. Thank you. I'm going to pass it back to Samira.
Yes, so we've got a final comment from Mac, M-A-K, in the chat, which resonates with me so deeply. So Mac says, my urge is often to respond to everything in the climate movement and having a desire to take in everything, leading to lots of blind spots as I dart around and make little time to rest and for a focus to emerge where I can use what I've learned from climate activities and ground it in the context I'm living in. I think the journaling prompts have only reminded me more of the call to rest and recenter after COP. And absolutely taking that with me, like the journaling prompts you've shared with us today, I'm going to keep coming back to them. So like the first thing I wrote was, yesterday I wanted to cry. Today I feel a sense of calm and I'm inspired. So I'm wondering how I'm going to feel tomorrow. And I just, to close off, I just wanted to say thank you all for being here today and for staying with us longer as the event did overrun. And I want to go back to the reflection from Rebecca Solnit, which always, when I am feeling like giving up working in the climate movement, where Rebecca says, hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away. And though hope can be an act of defiance, defiance isn't enough reason to hope, but there are good reasons. We may be living through times of unprecedented change, but in uncertainty lies a power to influence the future. Now is not the time to despair, but to act. So I'll close off with that, and thank you all so much. We will be sharing more resources, and please keep an eye out on our social media for future events.